So I'm going to be talking, so the way we've split this session is I'll give a little bit of more contextual stuff about SMEs in New Zealand, and then I'll allow Matt to dive in with more kind of business insights about COVID and how businesses are coping at the moment and things like that. So yeah, it's really good to be here, and thanks very much for the opportunity. Sorry. So as you all know, Aotearoa in New Zealand, we're probably one of the most isolated places in the world. We're located in the middle of the South Pacific. Our nearest neighbour is 3.5 hours flight away. If that's to the east coast of Australia, it can be 8 hours to Perth, and I don't know how many to Darwin. If you go to the other way, it's about 12 hours flight to Santiago. So we're pretty far away, even with modern technology, and under normal circumstances, it still takes quite a while to get places. However, we're a very open trading nation, and this has been one of the sort of foundation for how New Zealand came to be. When the British came to New Zealand, they encountered the Maori very open to doing trade with them. And some people would argue that the founding document of New Zealand in a way can be seen as part of it, can also be seen as, you know, based on trade. So people wanted to formalize their trade routes, and one of the reasons they signed the treaty was to ensure that this could be done. So very much a founding aspect of the New Zealand business environment. So trade continues to be very important. At the moment, we are hosting the APEC 2021 meetings. Trade agreements are very, very big here. Most recently, we managed to get Boris to agree in principle to an FTA with New Zealand. And as you can see, there's the CPTPP, which is one that Australia is in as well as countries in Latin America, Canada, and Southeast Asia. And that one is notable in terms of SMEs because it has its own chapter dedicated to small and medium enterprises. So I think that it signals how there might be a shift coming in how policymakers are viewing SMEs, in the sense that it goes beyond the rhetoric of they're the engines of the economy, and more towards they are a particular group of businesses that is very very different, but also very dynamic, and that I think that can only be a good thing. So from that outward looking, with the many successes in New Zealand business, these are just, you know, some I found around the place. Yes, lots of sheep still here, dairy, wine coming along. We've got space, we've got bungee jumping and film industries, all sorts of things coming out of this mentality of, you know, Kiwi ingenuity. Now, what does that mean in terms of small businesses? I think it gives some agility to decision making, flexibility, willingness to try something new. And I think in the context of, you know, the meeting in Glasgow and COP and everything else, climate change is very much at the top of people's minds, especially in the last few years. And so I think you could argue that this number 8 mentality is also being used to promote more sustainable business practices. So as you can see, a number 8 wire is not the most, you know, flashiest items, but it denotes reusing and using things in a way that do the job. So I think those are kind of aspects that underpin what SMEs in New Zealand do, or how they operate. When it comes to this pandemic, similar to Australia, there have been a series of measures. There's been $62 billion put into a COVID recovery fund that has just recently been topped up, and that has included, you know, the wage subsidy scheme similar to JobsKeeper in Australia. Some of it allocated to apprenticeships and industry training, and some jobs to plant trees, basically, and a little bit into infrastructure. So these measures have been good at helping businesses, I guess, stay afloat and up to a point. But what is obvious to me, just as an observer, there is still a lot of concern about what will happen, what is, you know, happening at the moment. So headlines are everywhere about problems getting staff. There's problems with global value chains. So some shops do not have stock. There's a big shortage of timber in the construction industry, for example, those sorts of things. There have been good stories with the uptake in digital technologies, which similar to other places, contactless payment, for example, and other processes have been taken up by small businesses quite a lot. There's been drive to collaborate, so quite a lot of businesses coming together in non-traditional ways. So the traditional industry association or that sort of thing still plays an important role. However, there are more and more groups coming together online. And this is just one example, the Manaki online community, which came about during the pandemic, and they link businesses together, so for mentoring and advice and general support. So these are all new things that came out of the COVID, but through concerns that SMEs had about how to survive it. In the hospitality industry, there are examples of restaurants coming together and sharing recipes and putting them in a book or kind of a PDF, if you like, and making that available to customers to keep sort of those relationships alive. So I think these are all important aspects of the concerns that SMEs have. And the concerns going forward is how are they going to deal with the extra red tape that is coming up because of the vaccination requirements. To, you know, basically you have to be vaccinated to operate. That's what the government is saying. How are they going to survive financially? Yes, the skill shortages and the global value chains are still quite big on their radar as well. And then finally, is this kind of era of collaboration and buy local, is that still going to carry on? So lots of people are supporting small businesses and buying from them at the moment, or trying to. Is that going to keep going or not? So I'm going to stop there and pass it on to Matt, and then we can have questions later. Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya. Kia ora, everyone. Ko Matt, toko ingoa. That's a traditional Māori greeting. My name is Matt. I'm Director of Business.govt.nz. We are the government's online support for small business. And I'll loop around to this towards the end of the talk, but one of the key themes that's emerged over this period is really an increased government focus on small businesses and their needs and the work that groups like the SEAANZ is doing. So that's been really a positive factor. I'm going to focus my talk in two sort of areas. The first is a very quick run through of the New Zealand perspective, building on what Tanya has presented. And then the second area, I'm going to look at some of the data as it's affecting small businesses. So I'll just share my screen. The New Zealand small business experience. So won't come as a surprise to many of you, but obviously there was a big dip in the economy as global economy shut down last year. New Zealand actually fared quite well through this. We were, as an island nation, quite isolated, and the government had a good response to COVID overall, and that enabled firms to keep trading through a lot of that. Now, that was pre-Delta. Delta, of course, has been challenging for countries all around the world, and Australia and New Zealand especially. Now, this data is really recent data from Xero. Xero, the online accounting software, have a big footprint in Australia and New Zealand and the United Kingdom, and they share insights with us occasionally. And so what this data shows is this is the sales as lockdown thwarted activity. And it showed relatively resilient sales in Australia and the United Kingdom, but New Zealand really spiking up for a while and then crashing right down. This slide here shows that the economic conditions for small businesses have worsened across all three countries. You really see a pronounced double dip there, the second dip being Delta, even with vaccination rates. And of course, as Tanya said, New Zealand still has lockdowns in place for our largest city, Auckland, where about half of our small businesses are. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I get on. The final, second to last slide on just some data. Again, this is from Xero, and this shows that New Zealand job market is really tight at the moment. And that's a factor of how difficult it is to get into New Zealand at the moment. Currently, we force people to go into managed isolation, and there's only limited spots there. So we've got a tight labour market, but of course that's not necessarily a good thing for small businesses. It is really hard to attract talent at the moment. So what we're seeing, and I'll take through each of these different types of experience, for small business, all this has sort of panned out for some small businesses. They're finding that they've been able to spend some time at home, locked down, where perhaps they can escape from their families. They've been able to focus on upskilling, working on the business, and improving their digital literacy, for example, selling online, and may have come through this, in fact, stronger with greater resilience. Then some businesses are really struggling, especially in Auckland, especially in sectors where trading has been really limited, and it's very difficult or impossible to trade online, and that's in hospitality, accommodation, events, education, and tourism. And finally, there's stressed businesses, and while these last two categories really overlap a lot, what we've pulled out here is that sole traders and micro businesses have found really lumpy revenues, and in some cases, this has been really stressful, especially for Auckland businesses. So I'll pick up each of these themes. Now, the first one, which is the silver lining, perhaps, from the COVID experience and the lockdowns, has been that we have seen a lot more time by small businesses spent on their business. So that's understanding how to improve systems and processes. And these charts here and some of these numbers, they reflect usage of Business.govt.nz resources. So if you think we've got about 500,000 small businesses in New Zealand, that's businesses with fewer than 20 employees, what we're seeing is a huge uptick in the number of businesses using resources to help improve productivity and business performance. They've been used, it's now around 300,000 times since the March lockdown, and that's about an increase of, I think, about 50%, and then also a big increase in digitisation resources. The government has focused lots of resource on this. We've got a digital boost campaign, which is free for small businesses. They sign up and they can get a variety of one-to-many support, like Business.gov offers, then also one-to-some support with small groups of businesses working online with experts and different organisations, and then one-on-one resources as well. And this has been part of a real focus on government to try to raise the digital capability of small businesses. In some countries, there's been a focus on sustainability and helping around the world and helping small businesses by offering incentives as part of the support packages offered to help businesses survive through COVID, offering the opportunity to become more sustainable. Business.gov, as was mentioned on one of Tanya's slides, has created a climate action toolbox, which has been used 15,000 times since we launched it about 6 months ago, to create action plans and understanding amongst small businesses how to reduce their carbon footprint. Now, recent studies and surveys in New Zealand are a bit disappointing, though, in terms of how far small businesses and how fast they're moving in that space. So I wouldn't really say that's of the same order of uptake as the digitisation and business performance resources. The second category I've sort of blended together, and that's really looking at the struggling and stressed out businesses, especially in Auckland. What our insights have shown is that this second lockdown in Auckland, so in New Zealand, we had a first lockdown with lots of other countries that lasted about 6 weeks, and then it was gradually easing, but the second lockdown in Auckland, which has now been going for 3 months, not really tackling Melbourne's record there in global lockdown competitions, but it has been a really tough lockdown for our Auckland businesses. I'm a part owner of a sustainability-focused business in Auckland, and talking to my directors up there, it's really easy to forget how tough they're finding it running businesses. And every time I get on the phone, I need to remind myself how stressed they are. So the cause of the stress has been financial losses, high uncertainty, restrictions put on businesses, slowdowns in supply chains, challenges operating across borders, increasing price pressures, high demand for goods and shortages like in microchips, perhaps if that's something you need, and then high labour costs and difficulty retaining staff. All of those pressures and a real sense that the mental health and well-being of small businesses in Auckland is now at a critical point have prompted the government just in the last few weeks, well, about 10 days ago, to announce an Auckland business support package worth 60 million New Zealand dollars. And that $50 million of that is for advice and guidance. So that's to pay advisors across New Zealand to have one-on-one conversations with small businesses to help them understand what they can do to survive the second lockdown. The second part of that is $10 million, which has been put aside for mental health and well-being. And I've been really quite closely involved in this $10 million package. It's been delivered with help from the Auckland business community, the Auckland Chamber of Commerce, and Auckland Unlimited, which is the economic development agency in Auckland. We've been working very closely with the Ministry of Health, the Mental Health Foundation in New Zealand, and really recognising that a psychosocial response means first try and treat the cause with the $50 million, but also offer one-to-one resources in the form of counselling, EAP-styled services, and wellbeing resources. And right now we're scrambling to put together that package and make it available to small businesses in Auckland for free as soon as possible. And there's about 200,000 small businesses in Auckland that will be have this package available to them. That's sort of the main things I was just going to cover. And I think just stepping back a little while, I think the key things that we could look at from Tanya's slides and from mine is, and I think it's emerging throughout today's symposium, and that is there's a lot more focus on small businesses than there used to be. I remember when I started in this job, it was quite hard to get ministers to pay attention to small businesses, and ministers outside of cabinet who weren't very important generally were put on the small business portfolio. Now small business is really a headline issue that the Prime Minister often talks about, public's talking about. It's a much hotter topic, and there's much more recognition in the challenges that small business face. There's a recognition, I think, that small businesses are the engine of growth. And one statistic, although I wouldn't take it too far, that discussing with a chief economist in New Zealand was that a well-known guy called Cameron Bagri, is that you could calculate and say that about 63% of new jobs, that's jobs that didn't exist previously, are created by small businesses. So they really do form a dynamic part of our industry, and we are reliant on them to enable us to grow. As Tanya said, the challenges with small businesses, there's just an ongoing piling up of compliance challenges on them. And that's because we expect our people to come home from work safe. We don't want people getting hurt at work. We're expecting businesses to become more sustainable. We want them to comply with new climate action rules. New Zealand is aiming for net carbon reductions of 50% now by 2030, announced at COP. And so all this pressure does flow down onto small business owners and really is creating a lot of stress and making life difficult for them. It's not saying it's not essential, but it does create challenges. And what we're focusing on in the New Zealand government with the business community is trying to deliver increasing tools and resources and guidance to allow them to deal with those compliance and sustainability and productivity, digitization challenges with really effective tools online, in some cases, one-to-some in some cases, and then one-to-one, but trying to create what we're calling a graduated landscape of support so that small businesses can start to try and get the type of support that big businesses have always enjoyed. And so we're trying to offer that increasingly to small businesses through sites like Business.govt.nz. Thanks.